Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to co-host this meeting with RIETI on behalf of CEPR. I am Refet GURKAYNAK, professor at Bilkent and program director of CEPR's Monetary Economics and Fluctuations Group. We're very lucky to have Tommaso Monacelli to give the first talk. Tommaso is a professor of economics at Bocconi and a research affiliate at Bilkent, at CEPR. I wish he would be at Bilkent too. And his presentation will be followed by a discussion by Ippei FUJIWARA, a faculty fellow of RIETI and a research fellow of CEPR, as well as a professor at Keio University. So, Tommaso, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here, and thanks, of course, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So the object of my presentation, to keep it short, is monetary fiscal coordination in periods of surging inflation. The traditional view is that conquering inflation should be only a duty of monetary policy. But typically, not much is understood on what fiscal policy should be doing aside of the typical duty of monetary policy of trying to tame inflation. Should fiscal policy be a complement or should be a substitute of monetary policy? Should fiscal policy be expansionary during periods of tightening monetary policy, which of course runs the risk of a surge in unemployment and a slowdown in economic activity, or should fiscal policy actually be tightening? So all over the world, the monetary policy response to rising inflation, of course, has been a rise in interest rates. This is a picture that shows how wide the phenomenon has been throughout different countries. As far as fiscal policy is concerned, right, this graph shows funding allocated by different countries to address the energy crisis. The fiscal policy response has been, as this data show, largely expansionary in terms of trying to shield, especially the low-income families from the burden of the rise in energy prices. So if, in terms of giving some numbers, the allocated funding to the energy crisis in percent of GDP skyrocketed to 7.4% in Germany, was 5.1% in Italy. So these are very large numbers, suggesting that in this period of rising inflation, with the tightening cycle of monetary policy, fiscal policy has been largely expansionary in trying to address the energy crisis. So what is the consensus that I can summarize through the IMF World Economic Outlook on the monetary fiscal relationship during periods of rising inflation? Monetary policy, says the WEO, should stay the course to restore price stability, and fiscal policy should aim to alleviate the cost of living pressures while maintaining a sufficiently tight stance aligned with the monetary policy. So there is a two-tier element in the allocation of duty for fiscal policy, alleviating the cost of living on the one hand, but at the same time maintaining a sufficiently tight stance aligned with the monetary policy. But if we look throughout different countries in the current window of the monetary policy tightening, we see combinations of fiscal and monetary policy which are all over the place. In some countries, there is monetary tightening paired with fiscal loosening. In some other countries, monetary tightening paired with fiscal tightening. So the picture is very mixed, despite the fact that, as the title of this symposium is suggesting, inflation is definitely a global phenomenon. So we'll try in a very few minutes to give an answer through the lens of a model. So trying to give at least a more educated answer to the question of, in a period of high inflation, throughout a monetary policy tightening, what should fiscal policy be doing? So the type of modeling framework that I have in mind is a minimal deviation from a standard representative agent New Keynesian model to allow for redistribution. So that means having two agents, which typically one is an agent which is a permanent income consumer, and the other one is an hand-to-mouth consumer, which basically whose consumption is basically tied time to time to current income. So there is imperfect insurance in this framework, and so markets are incomplete, and there's typically a policy trade-off in this environment between standard aggregate demand stabilization and redistribution across agents. So I will speak of fiscal policy in terms of transfers. Okay, the similar logic would hold in terms of government spending, but to make the argument really very, very clear, I will limit myself to lump sum transfers. So each agent, so the hand-to-mouth agents, receive a transfer FT, which is the negative of a tax, and it's zero in steady state. The consumption of the hand-to-mouth agents is proportional to aggregate consumption, CT, and to the transfer FT, so that they rise in FT, so a transfer towards the hand-to-mouth agents, the hand-to-mouth consumers raises their consumption. So inequality in consumption is the difference in consumption between consumption of the saver and consumption of the hand-to-mouth. And this gamma T inequality variable is can be shown to be function of two main elements. One is the transfer. Okay, so a larger transfer FT towards the hand-to-mouth agents is going to reduce inequality. Okay, and the other is aggregate economic activity. Okay, so if this parameter chi is greater than 1, and chi is a parameter that signals the elasticity of consumption of the hand-to-mouth agents to aggregate economic activity, basically during periods of an aggregate recession, does the consumption of the hand-to-mouth agents reacts more or less than proportionally. I'm going to assume that chi is greater than 1, meaning that the income and consumption of the H agents react more than proportionally to aggregate income. So the inequality equation says that in periods of economic boom, so CT, aggregate consumption, is going up. If chi is greater than 1, it means that there is an effect of lowering inequality. Okay, when aggregate consumption rises, there is a fall in inequality. And in the steady state of this model, there is perfect insurance. What is the monetary policy trade-off in the context of this economy? Okay, let me reiterate the inequality equation, where gamma T is a function of aggregate consumption and transfers. Okay, so what is the effect of a transfer? Okay, a rise in FT decreases inequality directly, as you can see here. The rise in FT decreases inequality, a rise in the transfer decreases inequality. But then there is a general equilibrium effect, so that transfers FT affect aggregate demand. So if chi is greater than 1, so if the income of hand-to-mouth agents overreact, inequality falls further. Okay, so there is a direct reduction in inequality through the transfer, and a reduction in inequality because CT is going up and chi is greater than 1. So 1 minus chi is negative. Okay, so the amplification of inequality required the central bank to intervene and the central bank needs to engineer a recession plus a deflation to take inequality back to the perfect insurance, zero inequality, steady state allocation. So to wrap it up, there is a trade-off in this economy between stabilizing real activity, traditionally aggregate demand management, so as to minimize supply side price stickiness distortions. So the goal of keeping a policy of zero inflation, and demand side imperfect insurance distortions. So the need to perfectly stabilize inequality at zero. But there is a trade-off. It is impossible to stabilize inequality at zero and at the same time engineer aggregate demand stabilization, meaning completely stabilizing inflation and the output gap as in the traditional model. So the policymaker, the monetary policymaker will feature a welfare objective. So a goal of stabilizing inflation and stabilizing the output gap, which can be summarized with aggregate consumption. And this is like exactly, it's typically coming out from representative agent New Keynesian models. In the context, in the context of this model, there is also a motive for stabilizing inequality, okay, because of the two agent and the need of providing insurance across the two agents. So there is a distinct inequality motive in the welfare objective. So now the type of experiment that I'm engineering is an inflationary shock. Okay, so now I'm going to ask: there is a rise in inflation, which is going to affect inflation directly through a Phillips curve. So this is a Phillips curve. So I'm going to introduce a cost push shock, UT, that rises inflation independently of the output gap. Okay, and as traditionally we know, a cost push shock is a shock that generates a surge in inflation and a contraction in economic activity. It's a stagflationary shock. It's a supply side shock that generates the divergence between inflation going up and the output gap falling. Okay, that's the UT shock. So now I'm placing myself in a period of quote unquote high inflation. Okay, inflation is surging, economic activity is falling, and because the central bank is trying to tighten, and inflation is rising. Okay, so the optimality conditions, I don't have no time to discuss them, but basically these key optimality conditions suggest us something about what fiscal policy should be doing. Okay, and the intuition and the intuition can be described in the following way. So the cost push shock, which is generating a rise in inflation and a contraction in economic activity, also generates an increase in inequality. Remember this assumption of chi greater than 1. So real activity is falling because the shock is stagflationary. Okay, there is a rise in inequality. Okay, that's intuitively also empirically that inequality is rising in a period of decelerating economic activity. So the policymaker needs to engineer, and this is the fiscal side of policymaker, needs to engineer a transfer towards the constrained agents. So a rise in FT in order to stabilize inequality. Okay, this is what this equation basically is saying. So what this means, and this is the bulk of the argument, is that in a period of high inflation, okay, generated by a cost push shock, again, inflation is rising, economic activity is contracting, the fiscal policymaker should be expansion. Okay, so that's the result. That's the main takeaway that I would like you to take from the model, right? That in order to stabilize inequality, which is rising in a period of stagflation. Okay, inflation is rising, economic activity is contracting. The fiscal policymaker should engineer a transfer towards the constrained agents in order to stabilize inequality. So the kind of policy making policy mix that comes out through the lens of the model is that monetary policy should stabilize the cost push shock, right, as typically is done in a New Keynesian model, while fiscal transfers should be engineered in order to achieve perfect insurance. Okay, so the key takeaway, right, is that fiscal policy represented through an instrument of transfers, but again, the message would be the same if we were talking about government spending, is that in a period of high inflation, fiscal policy should try to stabilize the supply side shock, through a trade-off between inflation and the output gap, and fiscal policy should be expansionary through a fiscal transfer in order to achieve perfect insurance. Okay. So that's the message. Fiscal policy should be expansionary in periods of high supply side inflation. And this is true for transfers and government spending. Government spending in the face of a cost push shock should be countercyclical. So economic activity is falling because of the stagflationary shock. Government spending should be expansion. But so this message, right, may be worrying because it seems that a standard two-agent New Keynesian model is suggesting that monetary and fiscal policy should not cooperate in tightening in trying to address the surge in inflation. Monetary policy should be tightening, but fiscal policy should be expansion. This is what the message of the model is. Okay, but it's important to remember that in the background of all New Keynesian models, fiscal policy is recurring. I mean, by this I mean that in the long run, anyhow, the intertemporal government budget constraint must be satisfied. So the message of the model indeed is that fiscal policy should be expansionary if you want in the short run through transfers or through government spending, but in the long run, fiscal policy should be respecting the intertemporal government budget constraint. So a short-run expansion in government spending or transfers should coexist with expectations that the government will engineer a fiscal contraction in the future to stabilize government debt. Okay, so the deeper message of this two-agent New Keynesian model is that monetary and fiscal policy are substitutes in the short run. Monetary policy tightening, fiscal policy expansionary, right? But they should be complements in the long run, meaning that anyhow, expectations that the government will not violate the intertemporal budget constraint, and that eventually in the medium long run will intervene to stabilize government debt must be maintained. Okay, so this is the kind of fiscal regime called recurring. But in periods of high inflation, there is a literature typically designed as the fiscal theory of inflation that think of the possibility of non-Ricardian fiscal regimes. So regimes in which not necessarily the expectations that the government will intervene eventually to stabilize government debt are maintained. So if this is the case, so if monetary tightening is not supported by the expectation of appropriate fiscal adjustments in the future, right, fiscal and monetary policy will actually clash. And this is what Bianchi and Melosi define as a fiscal stagflation possibility. In that case, monetary policy will be tightening, raising interest rates, but this would generate a vicious circle of rising nominal interest rates, rising inflation, economic stagnation, and increasing debt. Okay, so the key underlying message is that the cooperation between monetary and fiscal policy is more sophisticated, must be more sophisticated than at first glance. Again, fiscal policy should be in the short run expansionary, as it is in many countries now, in order to shield part of the population from the increase in inflation. In the model, this is in order to address inequality, but should remain Ricardian in the sense that expectations should be maintained by economic agents that eventually government debt will be stabilized in the future. But for the proponent of the fiscal theory of inflation, inflation is always and everywhere a fiscal phenomenon when it is persistent, meaning when expectations that the government debt will be stabilized in the future are lost, okay, and are and go out of control, fiscal policy takes over, okay, and the independence of the central bank and the autonomous ability of monetary policy to control inflation gets lost, and we enter a regime of fiscal dominance. Okay, so there is a literature that within the fiscal theory of inflation that believes that in fact the reduction, the conquering of inflation in the US was not really a result of the Volcker disinflation, but it was only when during the 80s fiscal policy switched from being non-Ricardian to Ricardian, when expectations that government debt would be stabilized eventually became entrenched in the public. It was only then that the Volcker disinflation on the monetary side started to work, and eventually inflation in the late 80s was stabilized. So I think I'm out of time, and I'm summing up, right? So there is a view that high trend inflation of the 70s was conquered by fiscal policy stabilization, right? That it was critical that not only monetary policy through the Volcker extra tightening raised the interest rates dramatically, but it was critical that during the 80s fiscal policy also aligned switching from a regime of non-Ricardian to a regime of Ricardian policy. So yes, in the short term, fiscal policy should be expansionary in a period of high inflation, in a period of stagflation, right? But long run expectation of debt stabilization remains key. Otherwise, monetary policy loses the ability of controlling inflation. And of course, the question is critical for US and the Eurozone today, right? If you think of the US and the debate on the debt ceiling and the long run stabilization of government debt, if you think of fiscal rules in the Eurozone and the debate on whether and when fiscal rules should be reintroduced in the Eurozone, it's not entirely clear that fiscal policy is cooperating with the monetary policy, both in the US and in Europe, in order to keep inflation under control. So it's not entirely clear that expectations that fiscal expectations are aligned in the right way in order to allow monetary policy to do its job of inflation stabilization. And let me stop here.
This was excellent and fascinating. And at the very end, I think the discussion also begs the question of how come 30 years of very expansionary Japanese monetary fiscal policy that drove debt to GDP to 250% did not succeed in creating much higher inflation. And we can only hope that Ippei Fujiwara in his discussion is going to tell us.
Wow, you put lots of pressure on myself. But okay, first of all, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to discuss the fantastic paper. As usual with Tommaso's paper, I enjoyed reading it. I learned a lot. So basically, this paper is about the monetary and the fiscal policies against inflation, in particular the supply side inflation. According to the traditional view, maybe the seminal study by Eric Lieper, so monetary policy must be active. So the monetary policy rule must follow the Taylor principle. So that is basically in response to the inflation rate, real interest rate, not the nominal interest rate, real interest rate must be raised so that we can reduce the aggregate demand. And in order for the monetary policy to be successful in a price stability, fiscal policy must be passive, or in other words, recurrent. So that is, when the debt increases, government should increase tax or reduce expenditure. That's the traditional view. So mainly driven by the monetary policy. So what is unique and fantastic in this paper is the new ingredients. So the new ingredient is an explicit constellation of redistribution motive. So what is the new ingredient? That is the redistribution. So the monetary policy must be active. That's the same. But the fiscal policy needs to take into account the redistribution after the supply side shock. So the recession happens, inequality increases. For the insurance purpose, they need to be expansionary. So after inflation increases, so the monetary policy is increasing interest rate, try to reduce aggregate demand. On the other hand, fiscal policy for the redistribution purpose, in response to the supply side inflation, subsidy must be increased or government expenditure increased, so the aggregate demand must be increased. So could you check the direction of the arrows? Monetary policy reduces aggregate demand. On the other hand, fiscal policy try to increase the aggregate demand. In this sense, monetary policy and the fiscal policies are substitute in the short run. But in the long run, they are complements. Again, it comes back to the passive monetary policy. So fiscal policy must be passive in the long run. So the fiscal policy must be recurrent. So in response to the inflation rate, tax must be increased or government expenditure must be reduced. So the contractionary fiscal policy must be taken. So in this sense, monetary policy and the fiscal policy are complements. Directions are the same. Okay, so the summary. So this is a very nice paper with a significant relevance to the current policy debate about the optimal policy mix against the supply side inflation. And another fantastic point is a clear explanation is offered about the optimal policy mix through tank model. Anyway, so two heterogeneous agent New Keynesian model. So there are two agents, saving agent and hand-to-mouth agent. So the hand-to-mouth agent use all the money they earned for consumption, no saving. And Tommaso provided the micro-founded quadratic loss function showing the trade-off in a stabilization among three objectives: price, output, and inequality. So mechanism is crystal clear. So we can see easily why the fiscal policy must be expansionary in facing the supply side inflation. And this paper offers a very important messages. One is the new insight. Fiscal policy should be expansionary in periods of high supply side inflation, which is in line with the IMF view. But this is not everything. You need to be very careful. Long run expectations of debt stabilization is the key, because persistent high inflation is always and everywhere a fiscal phenomenon. To be honest, I would like to stop here. Paper is fantastic, and I learned a lot, but I was given a chance to discuss the paper. So let me comment just 2 points, because time is limited. Okay, first one is the possible time inconsistency in a fiscal policy. This is indeed a point raised by Tommaso at the end of his presentation. So this is the time series of the public debt, the debt, total debt to the GDP ratio for key economies. So this is including a private debt, but there's not that much difference in the private debt and the government debt. After the Lehman crisis, there's a significant increase. Although we can see some signs of the consolidation in Germany, but in many countries, it's increasing. And if we look at the recent event, COVID-19, again, debt increased massively. So what I wanted to say here is unprecedented events happens almost every decade nowadays, global financial crisis and COVID-19 and the Ukraine war. So I think this is not the question to your paper, but this is really a tough problem which the policymakers are facing everywhere. So can we have a short-run expansionary fiscal policy, but with a long-run fiscal contraction? Yeah, that's really difficult. I cannot see any clear picture. And Refet mentioned about Japan, we are getting into not just aging, super aging. So baby boomers are now over 75. So we will see the significant increase in the long-term care, health insurance, and the public pension. So structural factors such as aging makes fiscal consolidation even more challenging. So yeah, how can we have a very nice picture about the short-run accommodation, but the long-run fiscal consolidation? So it's a big issue. And the final point is that, a bit the tiny point. So it's about the elasticity of the hands-to-mouth agents' income to aggregate the income. So in this paper, it's assumed the chi is larger than 1. So this leads to ex post heterogeneity in consumption. So relatively smaller hands-to-mouth, that is the poorest consumption. This paper is not about the income inequality, about the consumption inequality. Then I recall the papers in the macrofinance, like Aitzaharia Parker and Yogo in the Journal of Finance, and Jonathan Parker and Annette Wissing-Jorgensen American Economic Review paper. So they are saying, so the consumption of the rich are volatile and are more pro-cyclical. Of course, Tomaso's case, it's conditional. So these papers are about unconditional. So there's a differences, but they are saying, rich people's consumption decline more in a recession. So I would like to see the maybe empirical evidence to support chi is larger than 1. So this is minor topic, but thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss fantastic paper. I learned a lot. Thanks.
Excellent. So we don't really have time for a discussion, but it would be a shame not to have any. So we may as well take one, and I can kick it off by asking the following. So it's one thing to have an activist fiscal policy in terms of the fiscal policymaker minding the redistributive properties and therefore minding the hand-to-mouth consumers. But that doesn't make fiscal policy as a whole expansionary. So you may actually have a neutral fiscal policy at all times and tax the regular consumers so that you are distributing to the hand-to-mouth consumers. Why is that not why is that not part of the optimal policy regime? So let the aggregate stabilization be the monetary policy job and the redistribution be the fiscal policy job, but fiscal policy is neither expansionary nor contractionary at any time.
That's a question for me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, no, you're right. So you're right. So this is a simple model, and the kind of fiscal policy architecture that comes out of this is exactly that. In terms of transfers, you can the transfer is from the savers to the hand-to-mouth consumers. So in principle, fiscal policy can be neutral, but definitely it doesn't go in the direction of tightening. Okay, yeah. So that is an important message when it comes to designing fiscal policy in terms of a government spending instrument. Instead, the model shows that government spending, if taxation is progressive in the model, government spending should be expansionary. So there is a general message from the model that fiscal policy should be expansionary. But I agree with you when it comes to defining them to defining fiscal policy in terms of transfers. In principle, that can be neutral in terms of effects on government debt. But the message definitely is that fiscal policy is not tightening. So it's not, in the short run, it's not tightening as monetary policy is tightening, because one could reasonably raise the point that, okay, why should only monetary policy do the job of tightening to tame inflation, right? Why doesn't fiscal policy help in tightening the budget? And typically this doesn't happen, okay? And a model supports this view, provided that the long-run view of debt stabilization is not lost.
This is wonderful. It also, I think, speaks to a nation's literature of distributive effects of monetary policy, which there are. And I think a natural corollary of your point is you want to let monetary policy focus on the aggregates and let fiscal policy pick up the pieces on the distributive side, making sure that that sustainability is not sacrificed.